Hey! This is an introduction to creating class-based code in JavaScript, also known as OOP in JavaScript, Object-Oriented Programming. Now, because it is a classless, prototype-based language, special syntax is applied to our JavaScript in order to achieve OOP features that we see in languages such as C++, C#, PHP, Java, Perl, Python, and more. JavaScript has no class statement for establishing your classes like other popular languages do, but this does not mean that we cannot create class-based code in JavaScript. We just go about it a little differently. Now, a major focus of this video is to stress the benefits of OOP in a general sense, and to stress how OOP is simply a style of programming and not always a requirement of your application to make it work correctly. So we're going to discuss the occasions when a programmer is required to OOP, or when it would benefit a part of your application if your code was that way, which is something that a lot of teachers and professors forget to explain to students. So what happens is the student learns the basic syntax, but does not learn when and where they must apply object-oriented programming in real-world projects. Now, as we're discussing object-oriented programming here in JavaScript, just keep in mind that the same general logic would apply to any language that has object-oriented features. And there are more advanced topics to OOP in JavaScript that we will not cover in this video, that we might address in future videos depending on how this video is rated and commented on by you guys. You might find it extremely boring or not very useful, and in that case we won't cover it anymore and go into the more advanced topics of it. Okay, first we'll talk about the basic syntax for creating classes in JavaScript, and then we'll talk about its benefits and usefulness. So create a test.html file, and let's open up a script tag, go down a couple of lines and close it. Now in PHP we use the class statement in order to establish our classes, but in JavaScript we simply use function. So type in function, example class, open close parentheses, put an opening curly brace, go down a few lines and put in your closing curly brace. Now here's the nest all ready for your class, and inside of it you put properties and methods that you can tap into when you're coding instances of this class in your applications. So in order to create a property within this example class, we're going to type this.property1, and you can name your properties whatever you want. We'll make this one equal to a number. Let's make another example property. This.property2 is going to be equal to the string world. And you can have Boolean values in here as your properties. You can have array values if you want. Or you can just have a property assignment like that with no default value. You can just establish the property if you like and not give it a default value. So it's similar to just creating your variables in JavaScript. And these properties are only accessible within the class. And your methods are also accessible only within the class. So now you know how to set up your properties, and in a moment we'll show you how to access all of this stuff in the front end of your applications. Now methods are like dynamic functions, but these dynamic functions are owned by the class. So creating a method is similar to creating a function. We say this, and you give the method a name. We'll just name it method1 is equal to function, and you name your function the same thing. Method1, open close parentheses, open the curly brace, and go down a couple of lines and put in the closing curly brace. Now within the methods parentheses here is where you can supply dynamic arguments coming in. So we'll name this argument1. If you wanted multiple arguments coming in, you could put arg2, arg3, and you could really name them whatever you want, but that's how you supply arguments into that function dynamically when you're coding instances of this class. So within method1, we're simply going to return some data, which is going to be a concatenation of argument1 and this dot property2. So when we call method1 to run, it's simply just going to return some data to the calling code. Now what you're looking at here is the most basic syntax of a class in JavaScript for object-oriented programming. And if you're used to JavaScript and you've ever used closures in JavaScript, you'll see that it's a little bit similar, but the syntax varies just a little bit. And you can also prototype your methods if you want. But those are concepts that we'll talk about in later lessons if you guys are interested in this concept. Now we'll demonstrate how to tap into that class, that way you can code against it when you need to. So we'll create a variable and we'll name it instance1, And you can be naming these properties, methods, and variables anything you want. I'm just naming them a certain way so you know exactly what they are for the lesson's sake. So var instance1 is equal to new example class, open close parentheses, semicolon. So now you've created a new instance of example class. And with instance 1, you can tap into all the properties and methods within that example class. Now let's just copy that whole line, go down one more line, and create an instance 2, which is a separate instance of this example class object. Now let's call method 1 of example class to run. So let's just use alert. We'll just alert ourselves some data just to see what is returned. So what we do is we say instance1 dot, and we apply method 1, and you can see method 1 takes in one argument. So in between parentheses, we're going to put the string hello, and that's going to be argument 1. When it's passed through method 1, it becomes argument 1 up here in your class, and then it can be used in the return data or data processing that you have going on inside of method 1. So this string hello becomes argument 1. And if you wanted to send multiple arguments, you just put a comma here and whatever values you want, another comma, an array, a Boolean value, more strings, whatever you want. And they can be taken into method 1 right here as arguments. Okay, so now let's run this in our favorite browser and see what it does. Press Ctrl S to save the file and run it in your favorite browser software. So you see I get hello world. So if you wanted to put that in variable form, you can just say var result is equal to, and then just grab this instance 1 where you called method 1 to run on this string, and then you can just alert yourself the result to see what the result looks like. Same thing, hello world. Okay, so once instance 1 is created, you can then use instance 1 and dot notation to access its properties and methods. So if I wanted to access property 1, I would just say instance1 dot property 1, and that's what will be alerted to the page, is the value 5. Now I can also change property values in my code anytime I want by saying instance1 dot property 1 is equal to 10, and then when I alert instance 1 property 1 the next line down, those changes will be in place already. See? So the alert is now 10. So that means the property within that class for instance 1 is now 10. But what if I alert instance 2 property 1? Because instance 2 is a whole different instance of this example class object. So its property 1 should have not changed from 5 to 10. So now let's run this in our favorite browser, and we should get 10 and a 5. The second alert is 5 because instance 2 property 1 has not been changed from 5 to 10 like instance 1 property 1 has. Okay, so this code up top here is your class, and this is the code that you're using to access that class and all of its properties and methods within it. Now in order to make this class code right here, we'll just take it out of this file. In order to make that a class file that is a modular class file that's external that you call into your scripts, you just create a new JavaScript file. And in that JavaScript file, we paste this code, which is our example class, and make sure we save this file as exampleclass.js. So you see I have exampleclass.js and my test.html here. So what I'll do is above that script tag, I'm going to open another script tag and make sure I close it again. And in this one, I'm going to put the source attribute equal to my example class.js. So basically what that does there is it includes all of the file within example class.js into my test.html file. So all of the code that lives in example class.js is now included into my test.html page. So now if I run this, I should get the same results. There's the 10, there's the 5. That means we are in fact connected to the class. So this is how people create external class files in JavaScript, and it's how a lot of frameworks are also created. So if somebody is new to JavaScript and they find it all very difficult to learn, they can pick up a framework that some other more advanced coder created and put everything into objects and classes and methods and properties that the people can tap into without knowing very much. So you, as an advanced developer, you can be creating frameworks for dummies. Now when they learn it, a lot of people don't really see the usefulness of object-oriented programming after they learn the basic syntax, because what happens is instructors like me and teachers in schools, we will teach you the basic syntax of object-oriented programming in JavaScript, like we just did. But what did I show you? This example class doesn't do anything interesting in the real world. You can actually do the same things and get the same data processing and same data returned if this wasn't in a class. This could just be basically a dynamic external function and work the same way. So that's why a lot of people don't see the usefulness behind object-oriented programming, and this is where a lot of teachers fall short for their students. But what I'm going to try and do is go one step further now to show you an application that will not work right unless I make it a class file. Basically, my application will work the way I intend it to work if I put all my code into a class. If I don't put all my code into a class, my application's not going to work as intended. And this should show you the usefulness of object-oriented programming, and one such occasion where it would be a requirement of your application and not just a code style that's a preference. Because even though object-oriented programming is many times just a code style and a preference to the application author and not such a necessity to the application, but there are some times when object-oriented programming and class files are a requirement of the application in order for it to work right. So let me show you that example now. Okay, now in test.html, I'm going to replace it for all of this code. Now what I have here in the top of my HTML page is a script that I wrote for rotating a bunch of cogs, images. They're cogs. And I'll show you what it does. Let me render this in a browser real quick. See what it does? It spins those cogs. But what's happening is I'm having a collision in one of my properties, or one of my values rather. So one of my variables, this D variable, has a collision because this function animate does not create new instances of any objects. It just runs the animate function procedurally. So I'm running the animate function on image 1, image 2, and image 3, which you can see are right here. And those are my little cogs that you saw spinning. Now the first cog I want it to go clockwise. The second cog I want it to go counterclockwise. And the third cog I want to go clockwise. So they look like cogs should. See this one in the middle? That should be spinning counterclockwise for all these cogs to make it look like they're spinning each other. With them all spinning the same direction, it doesn't make any sense. So the one in the middle has to be going counterclockwise. So you can see my script here that I wrote, it does not allow that because my D variable is outside of my function. But if I was to take this D variable and put it inside the scope of a class, I can get the effect that I want. Now let me show you that code. Let's replace that with the object-oriented style of code for the same application. So basically what I'm doing is calling new instances of a class called rotate animation. And you can see my D variable is now inside the class as a property of that class. So now that I'm calling the animate function through these new instances of the rotate animation class, you'll see what I get. Press F12. I'll run this in my favorite browser. Now you can see that I have proper cog movement. The cog in the middle is going counterclockwise, like it should be, and there are no collisions in the degrees variable. Okay, so does that make sense? Basically, me putting it into an object-oriented style of code allowed me to avoid the collisions that I was having in that D variable. So that's one case, that's one occasion where knowing how to OOP and having that in your tool belt is very handy. So even if you're programming in C# or PHP or Java, you're going to have occasions where you'll have conflicts and collisions in the values that you're passing through these functions if they're simultaneously handling data. So if you have simultaneous data handling, you might get some collisions within your data. To avoid that, you can package everything up into a class file. So basically this whole script, this whole function rotate animation, which is a class, can be put into an external file called rotateanimation.js, and you can show other people how to use it by showing them this code, which is just the example code to get their images to spin by using your advanced external framework for rotate animations or whatever. Okay, now we're going to discuss the pros and cons, which is another thing that a lot of teachers or professors forget to do for their students when they're teaching them object-oriented programming, is explain the benefits and any negative effects that might occur from changing all of your code to procedural over to object-oriented or class files. So let's first talk about the pros, which are the benefits. So it makes your code modular and easier to share. So like you saw how I took that class and made it into a separate class file and was able to include it into my application and use all of the code within it. So that's how it makes your code modular and easier to share. I can then just take that class file and give it to all of my friends or beginners who don't know how to code that well. If my class does something really cool, like some kind of animation or data processing that's really complex or whatever, I can share it with them really easily, and they don't really have to understand all of the code at work inside of the class. All they have to understand is how to call the class and get the data passed through it. So people who are using code libraries and frameworks are simply using the modules or the libraries of code that somebody wrote for them. Okay, it avoids certain value collisions in certain software that you're creating. Like you just saw that rotation animation where I had multiple instances of an image spinning, and I had to have the one in the middle spin in a different direction. It was very simple for me to just put all of my existing procedural code into a class to avoid the collisions that were occurring in my values, which is a point that I have never heard anybody who teaches object-oriented programming bring up this point about avoid value collisions, because it's a very important topic that is a good feature of object-oriented programming, a good benefit that teachers never address. Now it makes your specialized functions reusable. So if you have a script or you have a website, and on that website there's going to be 5 different pages that use a certain function, you wouldn't want to have that function on all 5 pages. So you can just make a class or a module out of it and then just include that function into those 5 pages that require it. It's a much smarter way to code. Now, what are the drawbacks or the cons, you might ask? And there's really only one. It takes a little bit more processing power for the server to be able to call a class file into a script and then code against it. So basically it adds more lines of code to your applications. So if you do not require it, there's no good reason to use it. So basically if your application is styled or coded in an object-oriented sort of way and everything is in class files, and it doesn't really need to be, you're overbulking your application just a little bit, and you're being dorky, extra dorky when you don't really need to, and all you're doing is adding bytes to your application. Because if you can use a procedural dynamic function in a modular external sort of way, there is no reason to put it into a class. No reason at all. If it works procedurally, you can still make it modular, external, reusable, share it with your friends, and everything without putting it into a class. But as I showed, there was an occasion where my little application did definitely require it, or it helped my application run better when I used it. So I had a good reason to use it. But if I didn't have a good reason, I wouldn't put it into a class. Okay, so I hope the code examples got your feet wet a little bit and you know how to at least set up basic classes for magic functions that you want to make reusable. And if you guys are really interested in the topic of JavaScript object-oriented programming, I can go a little bit further. Actually, object-oriented programming is a general thing to me. I don't view it as just being JavaScript. I don't view it as just being PHP. It's more of a way of coding in all languages when you have specific tasks where procedural code just won't handle it or is not the smartest way to go. So at my site, in text format, I'm going to be covering advanced topics for object-oriented programming like polymorphism, abstraction, encapsulation, inheritance, and things like that. because you can also make subclasses that are children to your parent class. So there are more advanced topics that apply to all programming languages. So you'll see that the concepts that you'll find in JavaScript object-oriented programming are the same concepts that you'll find in PHP, C++, or whatever. So object-oriented programming is just sort of like a universal logic that you apply to your software, your applications, only when they require it. And I think a lot of people go wrong with object-oriented programming because maybe their teachers just tell them, make everything in your scripts a class. And they don't tell them why they're even doing it. So this is why you'll see a lot of people who understand that they can do most of these things with procedural code. You'll see them arguing with people who use class files, because basically the person who uses procedural code can reverse engineer the class file to make it procedural, and it'll work the same way but with less lines of code. So this is why you have these heated little debates.